Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing 52 weeks of Python. We are in bonus weeks and we're at week number 64. And in this lesson and the next one also, we're going to be talking about the Java programming language. So I've had requests to talk about Java. Some of you obviously have heard about it, want to know a little bit about it. So I will help you to get your toes wet in understanding a little bit about Java. Now, the first thing that we'll be doing is we'll be using a different IDE. This will be Intellij Community Edition, which is free. That's what you're seeing me do here. And in order to describe things like Python being interpreted versus Java being built and compiled and run, and the difference between statically defined objects or variables and dynamically defined as they are in Python, we will be looking at the very first lesson of our code from 52 weeks of Python, where we created a dictionary called device and a bunch of fields within the dictionary. Then we printed it out in various ways, and we're going to look at how we might do that in Java. We'll be touching on what it means to be a package. We'll be talking about how we don't use indentation, but rather we use curly braces. We're going to talk about how you don't just write code, but you need everything to be within a class. And for your main program, you need to create this method that looks like this and has your main line code in it. We're going to talk about static definition of data types and variables that use that, and how you can put items into your effectively dictionary, which is called a Hashmap. We'll talk about printing stuff, and you don't have a print statement, but you do system.out.println to print things to the console. We'll talk about referencing items within your Hashmap / dictionary type thing. And we will do a loop where we talk about iterating through a hash map, which is a little bit more difficult than just iterating through something simpler like an array list, but this is one way to do it. In Java, there's usually many different ways to do things. That's kind of true in Python as well. So we will look at one, hopefully the simplest way to do that. That's what we'll be talking about. So without any further blabbing by me, let's get started. So let's get started talking about Java by comparing it with Python, or rather looking at aspects of Python and then seeing if there's an equivalent in Java. And at the beginning here, I'm basically going to be pointing out what you don't get with Java that you do in Python. So one thing, in Python, I can come up here and type in Python 3, and I'm suddenly inside this interpreted terminal session with Python where I can write code. You cannot do that in Java. And of course, the following things you can't do either, but that means I can't write some code like this that says I equals 1 and j equals I, and then just say j and it will say what that value is, and I, it'll say what the value is, and I plus equals 1 like we've done before, and then print out I, which is now 2, j is 1. This is all stuff that I can do because Python is what we call an interpreted language. That means basically there's a line of code, and as soon as you've written it and you hit return in this example, Python is going to attempt to run that code. Now, behind the scenes, Python is actually going through a compile step and then running it. So it's not like it is without that step, but it behaves like it was completely interpreted. Java, there is no such thing as this, and consequently, you can't bop down into Java and just say Java and say, hey, I want to run some stuff, and just type in some Java code and see what happens. No, as you can see here, when you type in Java, you have many different options, none of which is just typing in Java. There's a whole lot of things. So it's definitely an order of magnitude in terms of complexity. Of course, with Java, you can do many things. Some would say exceeding what you can do with Python. It is a programming language for more computer science type people, but yeah, that's just a few of the things quickly from the command line. Now, ignoring the command line for a minute and looking at this code that we wrote, what can and can't you do in Java that you can in Python? Well, the first thing, if you look at this, this is just a file of code. You can't have that in Java. In Java, everything has to be defined with classes and objects. So in Python, if you've been following along with what we talked about, it's true what they say that in Python everything is not an object, but behind the scenes it's an object. In other words, this thing that you're looking at right here, that is actually going to be stored as an object in data in the memory of the Python interpreter that's doing this. So if I was to say I equals 1 right here, well, that I is an object behind the scenes. But with Java and with C++ and other object-oriented languages, everything has to explicitly be defined as if it was an explicit class, like when we've gone through the stuff that when we were going through object-oriented stuff. I'm looking for it right here when we began to get into classes and we looked at this device class. You can see here I'm defining something class device. And what we're saying is in Java, everything that you do has to be defined in terms of classes. And I will be showing you my implementation of the host monitor, which will demonstrate that in greater detail. But there's no such thing as just writing lines of code and doing stuff. It has to be encapsulated within a class of some type. Now there's ways to simulate what we're looking at right here with the minimum amount of classness, but in general, with Java, you're going to be defining everything as classes. Another thing that's very easy to do in Java is to do prints. Now you can do printing in Python. It's easy to do prints. Now it's possible to do that in Java as well, but it doesn't look so straightforward. You say system.out.println, and then you put the stuff that you're going to print out, things like these F strings that are handy. Some of that stuff is available in Java, but it may be less simple than what you are used to. Another thing to notice here is this thing here, pprint. What is pprint? Well, it's a library that I'm importing, because the thing that's true about Python is that hundreds, if not thousands of people have written code in Python that you can then easily install onto your system using pip, and then you can import it into your program and everything works magically. You can do similar things in Java, but the process is much more difficult, as we will see. So consequently, you see less packages. For example, you recall when we went through the networking chapter, we were talking about things such as PyShark, and we did Scapy, and we did Nmap. So we did all of these things because we imported these libraries. And you may ask the question, are libraries like that nice, simple, easy to use libraries? And the answer is there's probably code out there in open source world that you could compile and get to do these things, but it is nowhere near as simple as what we've done, like in this example where I'm just, I did a pip install and now I'm importing it and I'm running it. So things in general in Java are going to be much more complicated to do. You can do a lot, and some would say you can do more. Most of the high functionality cloud servers, as well as other software that you see out there, much of it is written in Java. But if you do comparisons of what's the most programming language at any point in time, you'll see that Python has grown significantly, almost exponentially, in the last 10 years. So Python does have many proponents. But we're talking about Java. You want to learn a little bit about Java, and that's what I will begin to go into next. So let's get started looking at Java code then, shall we? So the way that we're going to be writing our code is using an IDE. Once again, you recall we use PyCharm for our Python stuff, I have shown you, I believe, WebStorm. I certainly demonstrate that a little bit in the Quokka stuff, and that's where I did my JavaScript stuff. I also used Virtual Studio Code. That's what I've used most recently because WebStorm costs money, but PyCharm Community Edition does not. And you can see down here, Intellij IDEA Community Edition does not cost money. You can go to the website if you just Google, what did I Google here? I Googled Intellij Community Edition. Here's the site that we were just looking at. You can download, of course, they'll highlight download the one that costs money, but you can download the Community Edition. It does tell you what are the advantages of each. You can see Community Edition does a lot of the main stuff. There's certain stuff that's not available, that is only available in the Ultimate, which is the one that you pay money for. So I have the free one right here, and you'll notice that it looks pretty similar in many ways to PyCharm, so you don't have to relearn things. A lot of the hotkeys work exactly the same way. And if you look over here, you'll see, oh, I've got some Python code in here. This was my Python code from our first week, or our first lesson. I think it's in week 2 or maybe week 3, where we talked about creating a device dictionary. And I actually was not going to do this, and when I started to record this lesson on Java, I said to myself, why don't I just create the exact same thing in Java? And so maybe this will show you what Java is all about, learn a little bit about it, and see that while it's not to be feared, it definitely, there's more stuff going on from a computer sciencey type perspective. So over here, you'll recall we created a device dictionary. It had these fields in it for name, vendor, model, OS, etc. I printed it, and then I printed just an item from it by dereferencing the name. I did a pretty print, which isn't available. I'm sure there's stuff that I could attempt to build and then import, but I didn't do that. And then I looped through all of the items and print them out in a pretty format. So I did something similar in Java, and that's what we're going to look at now. Now this thing right here actually lives in the Quokka Prime world. So what I've done is I've implemented a host discovery in the Quokka Prime world. So if you're looking for code for this, then that's where you will find it, unless I have an idea to put it in the 52 weeks of Python, which I may or may not. We'll have to see about that. But it certainly will be here, and it is called device. So over here, L01 device. Over here, I'm calling it device with a capital D. That's because, as we mentioned, everything in the Java world is going to be an actual class that is instantiated. So let's begin to take a look at that code and see what it does. So now that we've reminded ourselves what this Python code did for L01 device, I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to get rid of the output from when I was running it and testing it. And we can look at an overview of this program, this Java program, and understand a little bit about what it is trying to do. Some of the stuff will be familiar to you, some of it will be new. I'll go into it line by line after I've provided this overview. So the first thing to notice is that we have import statements. So when we're going to be using things, in this situation, I'm using Hashmap and map. I'm going to have to import those. What you will find is that you have a boatload of things in a real program that you will be importing. So with Python, there's a whole lot of stuff that comes for free. You don't have to do any importing in terms of all of the things related to dictionaries and lists and stuff like that. Not so in Java. You need to let the compiler know everything that you are using. So that's that piece. We'll talk about package later. This is just how Java puts things together, is in terms of packages, and so we need to give it a name. And since this is living in my quokka.home directory, then it gives me this name, quokka.home. Now, we mentioned at the outermost level that we are going to be defining a device. So there's no such thing as just putting code in here and executing that code. Everything has to be in terms of a class. And you'll recall, I think you'll recall, you probably won't recall because I don't know that I mentioned it. Look at those curly braces. You do recall it from JavaScript. This is the way that most programming languages work. Instead of caring about indentation and making a big deal about that, like Python does, you use curly braces. That means indentation doesn't matter. You could put this entire thing on one single line that went way, way out here to the right, and that would be perfectly okay with Java. So you need to understand that. This is the beginning of the class definition, and down here you see it's the end. It's highlighted it nicely for us. Now here's a unique thing, and this is something that you'll see for your simple Java programs, and that is that you will have within your main class here, you will define a method. Remember, these things that we called functions are, if they're within a class, they're called a method. And so since everything's in a class in Java, then this will be a method. And here I'm defining something that is called main. This is what you will see your main program being defined as. You will see something like this. I'll go into it in more detail in a minute. And here's my curly braces. You can see that means that this stuff inside is my main application. In other words, when I run this program, when I compile this program and then run this program, it's going to run those lines of code. So let's look at the lines of code at a high level. Here you can see I'm creating something called device. Well, if you recall from what was over here before with Python, I had something called device2, and that was a dictionary. In this situation, I'm using something called a hashmap, and that is going to be like a dictionary in that it will have keys. I'm highlighting a key here, and it will have values. I'm highlighting the values. So if we consider the Python code that we were looking at, in fact, let me pull that up here. I think I maybe wanted to leave that up. So let me pull this up. Here's something for me to point out to you. I can do this and I can do split right, and you're saying to yourself, what's the big deal about that? We've done that for many weeks, and I will say to you, but you haven't done it in Intellij. We're not in PyCharm anymore, we're in Intellij, and so we can do the same type of things. Anyway, I digress. Here is my Python version, and over here is my Java version. You recall I created something called device. It was a dictionary, and it had these key value pairs. If you're wondering why it doesn't highlight this, because I could have installed a Python plugin to Intellij, so I could do both Python as well as Java, but I have not done that. So it knows a little bit about stuff like strings and puts them in green so that it's easier to see. It knows something about keywords, but that's all. Anyway, so we have something called device. Here I have something called device also. It is a hash map. I'm going over this at a high level, remember. Here you can see what am I doing to add items to my what effectively is a dictionary. It's a dictionary in the Python world. It is a hash map in the Java world. I'm adding items by using the put method on this thing that I've created, this hash map I've created. So this is the key and this is the value. Once I've done that, in a similar way to what I can do over here, I'm printing out the device. In fact, if I wanted to be consistent, I would put something like this, quote, device, colon, I need a space, and then I will say plus, and then it will print out the device. And if I want to be consistent here, I would have a space there as well. So Here's how I would print it out. I'm not using a built-in thing called print. I need to reference this system.out.println, and so that's going to print things and do a new line at the end. I am able to print out a hash map. It's smart enough to do that for me, so that's good. And when I print out just an item, I don't reference it like this. Remember how we did it in Python? I need to do a .get and specify the key. And then the last thing that we're going to go into more detail in a minute, I don't do pretty print, but I do this for loop. Here's my nice, easy to understand for loop, even though this is one of the more complicated ones because I'm iterating through a dictionary. What I need to do in this situation is I need to do something like this. This is what our for loops tend to look like in Java. They look this way in C and C++ as well. They're a little bit more complicated, but this is an old school way of doing it. I'll go into it in greater detail in just a minute. But that is the general idea. That is my program. Now let's look into it in more detail. All right, let's look at the code in a little bit more detail. Now, the first thing that you may notice is that there is a semicolon after every line. You're going to need that. It's required in many programming languages. In JavaScript, the requirement has been loosened, but for Java, it is still there. So you will end up with compilation errors if you don't specify that. Another thing I did want to point out is, and we mentioned this at the beginning, Python is an interpreted language, at least in the way it behaves. Java, you need to explicitly do a build once you have changed your code. So if you write code and then you go and run it and there's no changes, that if you're running it outside in a terminal window, as I have been doing for my host monitoring application, you need to make sure that you build it. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, let's look at this actual code. First of all, the thing that's like a dictionary is a hash map. The general idea of a hash map is an evolution from hash tables. Remember, dictionaries have keys and they have values, and the keys are like instantly accessed. You can get at it immediately. Remember our comparison of doing lists versus dictionaries in Python and how it took like 3,000 times longer for a large amount of data to find something in a list. The idea of a dictionary, or in this situation a hash map, is that we take the key and we get a hash of it and then we find it immediately. And that's what this is. So hash map is the thing that we tend to use. Now, the thing that you see in these angle brackets or less than, greater than signs is this is specifying what is going to be within my hash map. And it's saying the key is going to be a string and the value is going to also be a string. Remember over here with device, we could be loosey-goosey and change things around to make this into an integer. I could make other things into integers, or they could be other data types and stuff. And over here in Python world, you just go ahead and use it. Not so over here. This is the difference between a statically typed language and a dynamically typed language. A statically typed language, you define the type of the variable that you are defining, and then the compiler will ensure that you use it appropriately, as well as the actual execution time processing. It will make sure that you adhere to what you have stated. Over here in Python, remember, we can just change things around any way that we want, and it will go ahead and change things on the fly. This is a statically typed language, Java is, and therefore you need to define everything. Now, so I'm saying device is going to be this type of thing, what I've highlighted. It's going to be a hash map, and the key is going to be string, the value is going to be string. And now what I need to do is I need to create that hash map. And so this is where I'm going to create it. I use the new keyword. We don't do that in Python. We just use the class name. But in C type languages as well as Java, we need to specify new hash map. Now, the thing that we do after this, you're looking at that and saying, that looks like Egyptian hieroglyphics or Klingon language or something like that. It actually isn't. It actually kind of makes sense. This thing right here, these angle brackets, will end up being exactly what this is. So I'm saying create me a hash map, and I need to specify this type clues or indications. And so that is what this is doing. It would be a syntactic error if I omitted that. And then what I'm doing is I'm providing this opening and closing parentheses. That's telling me that this is my passing in arguments for the constructor. And as you can see, I'm not passing any arguments at all. So basically, this statement right here is the equivalent of doing something like up here in Python, if I was to say device equals dict. But in Python, in this situation, number one, I'm not specifying the data types for anything for that dictionary. And number two, I'm not making it statically defined so that I can change dictionary if I want to at a later point in time. So that's basically what this is doing. Now, to add items to my hash map, there are many different ways to do this. If you were to look up how can I initialize a hash map, you will find at least 5 different alternatives ranging in simple, which is what I'm showing you here, to complex, which uses other functionality that we're not going to be going into. And so what I'm doing is showing you one of the ways to do that, and that is to say, here's my hash map called device. I want you to call the put method, and I'm passing in 2 parameters. One is the key. The first thing is the key. The next is the value. And you can see I'm doing that 6 times to set the data for device to all of these values. So that's all that is doing. But you'll notice I need to do put in order to put data in there. I don't use the method that we use here, which is what I could have done if it was in Python. And when I want to get the data, I need to access it via this get method as well. And here I'm passing in the actual key, which is name. Now you'll recall in Python we did things with constants and enums. Of course, you can do the same things, in fact, in a more structured and probably better way in Java, but this is just a simple program, and I didn't want to belabor what we're doing. That is how we are actually printing this out and accessing it and setting it. In fact, if I was to run this, I'm running a device right now. It should be popping up a window down here at the bottom, like we see normally. There we go. And we can see, I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see all of it. Here is my printing out of device. That's this first line right there. Device colon, and then this is actually, it's smart enough to print out this data for me. So it's smart enough to print out a hash map, so that's good. The second thing is this one right here that I have highlighted. That's where it prints the name, and that you can see it's gotten the name. We can see that's the same as right there, in case you don't believe me. Now the next thing and the last thing that we're going to talk about is a for loop. And so you will look at this for loop and say, wow, that's kind of complicated. And in fact, it kind of is, but let's deconstruct it and figure out what's going on based on what we've talked about so far. So again, how do you iterate through a hash map? There are many different alternatives about how you can do this. I attempted to choose the simplest and the one that's been around the longest. And so the syntax of this is this. This is the thing that I'm iterating through. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this method called entry set, which is basically going to take my hash map and it's going to create an iterable list of these items. All right, so that in my In our Python terminology, that's what it's doing. It's creating something that is iterable, and each one of the items is going to be what they're calling an entry set or an entry, and the entry will have the key and the value. Over here on the left hand side, this is what my variable name is going to be. So every time I iterate through this for loop, just like we did for loops down here, every time I iterate through, I get key value like that. Every time I iterate through this, I'm going to have an item which will contain both the key and the value. And this thing right here is just identifying. Remember, everything is statically typed. Even when I go through a for loop, I need to tell it what type of data this is. And this is my type of data. It is an entry from a map. A map is a superclass of a hash map is all you need to know. And an entry is a key value pair. And so the one line that we're going to do over here, I did a pretty print with some nice formatting. Didn't do any nice formatting here. Sorry about that. I just printed it out. There's ways to do this for sure. I've done it in other programming languages, but right now I just kind of wanted to write it this morning and then talk about it, which I'm doing right now. I'm printing the key. How do I get the key? Well, here's item. Item is my variable name for the for loop, and I call get key on that variable. Same thing that we do here for item. I'm doing get value. That's effectively the same as doing this, but you can see Python has simpler, more kind of basic language. And that, my friends, is the Java version of this code right here with a few things that I didn't implement yet. Hopefully you've gotten a little bit of a taste of it. I'm not going to go through the actual code that implements the host monitoring until the next time. When we do that, just give you a sneak look ahead. If we look at that, I've got threads going on, I've got classes going on, I'm doing monitoring, and my monitoring is going to be doing HTTP stuff, and I'll be sending stuff, and I will be pinging. So I'm actually going to be doing pinging. I am keeping track of the time. I'm using this class called internet address. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Oh, and I had to define a host class. I can't just create it on the fly. So basically, I'm creating this class that holds all of my host information. That's what we'll be talking about next time. But I wanted you to be aware of what it is that we've done. Don't know why it didn't show me that up here on the top, but here's my little program that does a little bit of pretty simple stuff in Java. Okay, so let's review what we talked about. We talked about the difference between Java and Python, how with Python it's an interpreted language, so you can just jump right into the interpreter, type in some code, and see the results. In Java, you can't do that. It is compiled and then run, so there are differences there. We looked at some of the code. We looked at the difference between our first Python lesson, which created a dictionary and printed it out in various forms, and how you might implement that in Java. We talked about things such as the fact that everything needs to be within a class definition. Everything is truly an object, not just behind the scenes objects like with Python. And we talked about how we use curly braces rather than indentation. We talked about how even doing a simple program requires that you create a class and then implement this method for running your code. And we looked at the difference between dictionaries and creating something similar in Java. We did look at how you need semicolons at the end of every line, how you can populate your hash map, which is the equivalent of a dictionary name and keys, by using the put statement. When you want to reference some value within it, then you need to do a get statement where you get items from there. Here you see me getting the name. And if you want to loop through or iterate through a bunch of items in a dictionary, it's fairly complicated compared to Java. At least you do need to reference things, but it could be worse. In fact, it probably was worse in the earlier days of Java. So, oh yeah, and printing is not just using a print statement, but you need to do system.out.println. Anyway, that's a very quick review. Next time we'll be looking at some code that actually does something, that is the code that does host monitoring. Hope this made sense. If not, as always, let me know in whatever fashion you prefer. And again, thanks for watching and listening.